Sarah Miller clutched Tommy's small hand as they made their way down the narrow airplane aisle. The red-eye flight to Seattle was nearly full, and the exhaustion of the past few weeks weighed heavily on her shoulders. She adjusted the worn-out strap of her purse, feeling the anxiety settle deep in her chest. This move wasn't just about a new job. It was about survival. "Mommy, I don't want to sit by the window," Tommy mumbled, his lower lip trembling. At 6 years old, he was braver than most kids, but flying made him uneasy. "It's okay, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, squeezing his hand. "I'll sit next to you." As she settled Tommy into his seat, her eyes drifted to the man sitting beside them. He appeared to be in his late 30s, well-dressed yet unassuming, with dark hair that framed a face marked by quiet sorrow. He barely glanced up from the small sketchbook in his hands. Sarah offered him a polite nod before turning her attention to Tommy, who was already gripping her arm as the engines rumbled to life. "Mommy, it's too loud," Tommy whimpered. Before Sarah could respond, the man beside them shifted slightly. "Would you like to see something cool?" he asked in a deep yet gentle voice. Tommy hesitated, his big brown eyes flickering between Sarah and the stranger. The man lifted his sketchbook, revealing a detailed pencil drawing of a bear holding a tiny cub. "See? This little guy is scared too, but his mama bear is keeping him safe." Tommy's grip on Sarah's arm loosened as he examined the drawing. "Did you draw that?" The man nodded. "I did. My name's James, by the way." Sarah studied him carefully. There was something about his presence, calm yet distant, like a man carrying invisible wounds. "That's really good," Tommy said, his fear momentarily forgotten. "Can you draw another one?" James smiled faintly. "Of course." As the plane lifted off, Sarah watched in quiet amazement as Tommy became engrossed in James's sketches. Each bear had a story. One climbing a tree, another fishing in a river, a baby bear learning to roar. "You're really talented," Sarah found herself saying. James's smile was brief, almost sad. "It's just something I do to pass the time." Something in his tone made her hesitate. He wasn't just a man who liked to draw. There was a deeper reason behind his art. "Are you visiting Seattle?" she asked, trying to make conversation. James shook his head. "I live there. What about you?" Sarah exhaled slowly. "Moving. Got a job interview lined up. I don't know if I'll get it, but I have to try." James glanced at Tommy, who was now fully absorbed in a new drawing. "It's just the two of you?" "Yeah," Sarah admitted, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "His dad isn't in the picture." James nodded but didn't press further. He understood loss. That much was clear. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I had a daughter. Her name was Lily." Had. The word hung heavy between them. Sarah's heart clenched. "I'm so sorry." James stared down at his sketchbook, fingers tightening around the edges. "She loved bears. I used to draw them for her all the time. It made her laugh, even when she was sick." Sarah didn't need to ask what had happened. The pain in his voice said it all. For the first time in a long while, she felt an unspoken connection with someone, a shared understanding of loss, of fighting to keep moving forward when the past refused to let go. The flight attendant passed by, offering drinks, but neither of them moved to take one. James cleared his throat. "Where are you staying in Seattle?" Sarah hesitated. "A motel for now. If the job works out, I'll figure out something more permanent." James studied her for a moment, then closed the sketchbook. "I have a guest house. It's empty. You and Tommy can stay there if you need a place." Sarah blinked. "That's kind, but I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition." His voice was firm yet gentle. "I know what it's like to start over. And I know how hard it is to do it alone." Sarah's pulse quickened. Trusting a stranger was risky. But James didn't feel like a stranger, not entirely. Tommy tugged on her sleeve, holding up a new drawing. "Mommy, look. He made me a baby bear." Sarah glanced at James, searching his face for any sign of dishonesty. There was none, only quiet sincerity. Maybe, just maybe, this was a fresh start they needed. As the plane descended into Seattle, Sarah faced a decision that could change everything. Would she take the leap of faith, Or was trusting James too much of a risk? The plane touched down in Seattle with a slight jolt, the hum of the engines vibrating through Sarah's exhausted frame. She had barely slept, her mind turning over James's, off like a coin flipping endlessly in the air. Was she truly considering staying at a stranger's house? Tommy, on the other hand, was oblivious to her internal debate. He clutched James's latest drawing, an image of a baby bear clinging to its mother's back, with a kind of innocent joy that made Sarah's heart ache. As they moved through the crowded terminal, James walked a few steps behind, giving them space. Sarah was grateful for that. She needed to think. "Mommy, where are we going?" Tommy asked, rubbing his tired eyes. "To motel, sweetheart," Sarah murmured automatically. James spoke up. "You don't have to." She turned to face him. The overhead lights cast sharp shadows across his face, accentuating the quiet grief behind his eyes. He had barely said a word since the plane landed, but now that they were outside the airport, waiting for a cab, he was watching her closely, waiting for an answer. "James, I appreciate it. I really do," she said carefully. "But I don't know you." He gave a small nod, as if he had expected that. "That's fair. But I don't have any bad intentions. My house has a separate guest space. You and Tommy would have your own rooms. No pressure, just an option." Sarah hesitated. Every rational part of her screamed no. She had spent years being cautious, ensuring that no one could take advantage of her vulnerability. But then there was Tommy, who had connected with James in a way she hadn't seen him connect with anyone in a long time. And there was James himself, a man who knew loss, who understood the weight of grief and loneliness. The cab driver honked, breaking the silence. "Tell you what," James said, his voice steady. "Let me at least drive you to the motel. If you change your mind, I'll give you my number. No pressure." Sarah studied him, tried to find any sign of deception, but all she saw was sincerity. Finally, she exhaled. "All right, just to the motel." James gave a small nod, then led them toward the parking lot. The drive through Seattle was quiet, the city lights flickering against the rain-slicked streets. Tommy had fallen asleep in the back seat, clutching his stuffed rabbit and James's drawing. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said after a long silence. James kept his eyes on the road. "I know." "Then why?" He exhaled slowly. "Because I remember what it was like, trying to start over, feeling like every decision could make or break you." Sarah swallowed hard. "And did you?" "Did I what?" "Start over?" James was quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Not really." The weight of those words settled between them like a thick fog. Minutes later, they pulled up to a rundown motel. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly. Sarah stared at the building, her stomach twisting. It looked even worse than she had imagined. James pulled out his wallet and handed her a small business card. "If you change your mind," he said, "just call me." Sarah hesitated before taking it. Their fingers brushed for half a second, just long enough for her to feel the warmth of his skin. "Thank you," she murmured. James nodded once. "Take care, Sarah." Then he drove off into the night, leaving her standing in the cold, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Cliffhanger. As Sarah checked into the motel, a creeping unease settled in her chest. The room smelled damp. The locks barely looked secure, and Tommy whimpered in his sleep. As she sat on the creaky bed, staring at James's business card, a terrifying question whispered in her mind. Had she just turned down the only lifeline she had left? The motel room was worse than she had expected. The stale scent of mildew clung to the air, the sheets felt rough against her skin, and the old radiator rattled like it was on the verge of breaking. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering ceiling light, exhaustion pressing heavily on her shoulders. Tommy curled up beside her, his tiny body rising and falling with each steady breath. She brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers. He deserved better than this. The business card James had given her rested on the nightstand, the inked letters almost daring her to pick it up. She had sworn never to rely on anyone again. Not after Tommy's father had walked away, leaving her with nothing but broken promises and an eviction notice. She had clawed her way back from rock bottom once, She could do it again. But could she? She lay back, closing her eyes, but sleep refused to come. Every creak of the old building made her uneasy. The sound of distant voices arguing in the hallway sent a chill down her spine. And then came the knocking. Sharp, insistent, too close. Her breath hitched as she sat up, heart pounding. It was past midnight. No one should be knocking on her door. She glanced at Tommy, still sound asleep, then forced herself to stand. The peephole revealed nothing but darkness. The hallway's dim light had gone out. Her fingers tightened around the doorknob, her mind racing. She wasn't being paranoid. She had learned long ago that danger didn't always announce itself. She backed away, grabbed her phone, and without a second thought, dialed the number on James's card. He picked up on the second ring. "Sarah?" His voice was groggy but alert. She didn't know what to say. The words stuck in her throat, tangled with pride and fear. Then another knock came, this time softer, dragging. She sucked in a breath. "James, can you come get us?" Silence on the other end. Then, without hesitation, "I'm on my way." She hung up and pulled Tommy into her arms, whispering reassurances he couldn't hear. Minutes stretched into eternity. The knocking stopped, but the unease didn't. Then headlights flashed through the thin motel curtains, and a familiar hum of James's car engine filled the air. She exhaled in relief and grabbed their bags. She wasn't waiting another second. James was already out of the car by the time she stepped into the cold night air. His expression was unreadable as he took in her tense posture, the tight grip she had on Tommy. He didn't ask questions. "Come on," he said softly, opened the car door for her. She hesitated only for a second before stepping inside. As they drove away, Sarah glanced in the side mirror. A shadow lingered near the motel entrance, barely visible under the flickering neon light. A shiver ran down her spine. She had made the right choice. But deep down she knew this was only the beginning. James had always believed that some wounds never fully healed, that grief was a shadow, always lurking, waiting to resurface. But as he stood in the sunlit backyard of his house, watching Sarah and Tommy chase each other through grass, he realized something had changed. There was laughter here now, real, unguarded laughter, the kind he hadn't heard in years. Tommy ran up to him, his cheeks flushed with excitement, waving a small sketchbook in his hand. "James, look, I drew the biggest bear ever." James knelt down, taking the book with a smile. The drawing was crude but full of life. Big, round eyes, a playful grin. Not unlike the bears he used to draw for Lily. A lump formed in his throat, but it wasn't the same suffocating grief as before. It was something softer now, a memory that didn't hurt as much. Sarah joined them, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She looked different from the woman he had met on the plane. There was light in her eyes, confidence in the way she stood. She had started a job at a small design firm, one that allowed her to work from home and spend time with Tommy. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start, and James had found himself looking forward to every moment they spent together. As they sat on the porch that evening, the air thick with the scent of pine and fresh paint from the art studio James had helped set up for her, Sarah turned to him. "I never got to thank you," she said, her voice quiet, "for everything." He shook his head. "You don't have to." "I do." She reached for his hand, and the warmth of her touch sent a shiver up his spine. "You gave me more than a place to stay. You gave me hope." James swallowed, looking down at their hands. For so long, he had believed love was something he could never allow himself again. That opening his heart would mean betraying the memory of Lily. But maybe love wasn't about replacing the past. Maybe it was about carrying it forward. Before he could respond, a familiar voice interrupted them. "Rachel." She stood at the gate, hesitant but determined. Her gaze flickered between them, then landed on Tommy, who was busy drawing on the pavement with chalk. James felt Sarah tense beside him, but before he could say anything, Rachel took a deep breath. "I brought something," she said, holding out a small wrapped box. "For Tommy." Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. Tommy ran over, curious. As he tore the paper, a gasp of delight escaped him. A set of colored pencils. The kind Lily had always loved. Rachel's eyes met James's, and for the first time in a long time, there was no anger there, just understanding. Sarah stood and walked toward her, and though the moment was tentative, it was something, a bridge, however fragile, being built. James exhaled, feeling something inside him shift. Maybe grief never truly disappeared. But love had a way of filling the empty spaces. As Tommy ran back to his drawing, Sarah sat beside James again, leaning into him just slightly. He didn't pull away. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the yard. And for the first time in years, James felt like he was finally home.